When it comes to big guns, range is important, obviously. I mean, one of the main reasons to make a gun bigger is so it can shoot further. When we talk about artillery, that range is measured along the Earth's surface, horizontally. But for anti-aircraft guns, it's more about the vertical axis. Sometimes you just need to put a projectile very, very high up in the sky, because some aircraft insist on flying at ridiculous altitudes. For this, you're going to need extreme velocity and advanced fire control. You know, if you want to actually hit anything. Now, of course, guided missiles came in and rendered this whole idea obsolete, but super heavy anti-aircraft guns remain undeniably awesome. Which begs the question, what is the highest reaching anti-aircraft gun of all time? Or alternatively, the heaviest caliber AA gun, if that's not the same thing? Well, if we're limiting the criteria specifically to anti-aircraft guns, that rules out a few historical weapons that could fling projectiles to absurd heights. Like the Paris gun, the super heavy artillery piece deployed by Germany against France in 1918. I say super heavy, its caliber was only about 210mm, but its massive 21-meter long barrel gave it a muzzle velocity of 1,640 meters per second, letting it reach out to 120 kilometers, which of course put the French capital in range, to the disbelief of Parisians who at first assumed they must be under attack by zeppelins. Now, the only way to achieve this unprecedented range with conventional ballistics was to fire shells so high that they briefly left the lower atmosphere to reduce drag from air resistance. So the rounds went up to a maximum altitude of 42.3 kilometers, about 26 miles over 130,000 feet. The highest a man-made object had ever reached at that point, only surpassed by another German superweapon, the V2 rocket in World War II. But the Paris gun was not an anti-aircraft weapon. I mean, it wasn't even capable of tracking a moving target. It was designed to hit things that don't move, like, you know, Paris. And even then, it wasn't accurate against point targets within a city-sized area. Its shells would have needed more sophisticated fuses to be any good against aircraft, and its rate of fire was about 20 rounds per day. In other words, not a remotely practical anti-aircraft gun. So to find the highest firing AA gun, we're gonna have to settle for something a bit smaller. Something like the 12.8 centimeter Flak 40. Another German gun, this one in service from 1942. Germany's heaviest flak gun of World War II, this thing was a beast. Only about 1,100 were built, not many compared to the 21,000 8.8 centimeter flak guns. Unlike the more famous 88 though, which despite its bulk and weight could move around with relative ease, the 12.8 centimeter wasn't known for its mobility. Difficult to transport even by road, virtually impossible to tow cross-country, often deployed on twin mounts weighing 26.5 tons. It was designed with the assumption that it would be securely bolted to concrete, i.e. largely immobile. Though around 200 were mounted on rail cars, giving the gun some mobility, but the Flak 40 was most associated with fixed AA positions around major cities. The Flak Towers. In Hamburg, in Vienna, in Berlin, elevated firing positions gave the guns clean arcs over dense urban terrain, while the towers themselves doubled as air raid shelters and command centers. A single tower could mount 4 twin Flak 40s for 8 12.8 centimeter guns, plus clusters of 2 centimeter and 3.7 centimeter Flak cannons for close range defense. The guns on the Berlin Zoo Tower were reportedly used against Red Army ground troops during the final battle for the capital. But of course, their primary targets were high-flying heavy bombers. British Lancasters and Halifaxes flew by night at altitudes of around 16 to 23,000 feet, which was on the lower side because night missions made it less risky, in theory. American B-17s and B-24s, on the other hand, flying in daylight with increased risk of flak and fighters, went up to around 23 to 30,000 feet. But with a muzzle velocity of 880 meters per second, the Flak 40 could hurl a 26-kilogram shell up to 48,000 feet straight up. That's 14.8 kilometers, about 9 miles. Now, they were also in range of lighter weapons like the 8.8 centimeter, but AA guns aren't always shooting straight up, or at maximum elevation anyway. Targets are moving, approaching, departing, which means part of your ballistic performance gets spent horizontally. So a larger gun doesn't just shoot higher, it shoots further, for longer, across a wider engagement envelope. In practical terms, the 12.8cm could engage bombers earlier and track them for longer, while also delivering a significantly heavier projectile. The gun's 57-pound shell produced far more fragments spread across a much larger lethal radius, all while maintaining a respectable rate of fire at 10 to 12 rounds per minute. Plus, they were tightly integrated with fire control radar mounted on its own dedicated command tower. During the war, over 1,000 Allied bombers were shot down over Berlin alone. It's a safe bet that this gun accounted for more than a few of them. And Germany made an even bigger version. A handful of 15cm guns were built, with the prototypes known variously as the Flak 50, Flak 55, and Flak 60, firing a 40kg projectile at 890 meters per second to a maximum altitude of 16.3 kilometers or 53,000 feet. But with each gun weighing more than a Panzer IV tank, this time there was zero pretense that this was anything other than a fixed static fortress weapon. The flak towers were actually designed with the idea that at some point they could mount 4 15cm guns instead of 8 12.8s. But despite taking up effectively twice as much space, the ceiling of the 15cm flak wasn't that far above the Flak 40, which was already an absolute unit. And as such, there was even less appetite for mass production. Tested but never used in combat, the 15cm flak wasn't the heaviest operational AA gun of the war. Which brings us to Japan, who from June 1944 onwards had a similar problem with uninvited American planes showing up for some impromptu urban redevelopment. But these weren't B-17 flying fortresses, these were B-29 super fortresses. Super long range, super high altitude, pressurized cabins, remote controlled gun turrets. A total technological flex over the crumbling Japanese empire, even without that extra special payload. Though initially the B-29's enormous 2,000-mile range wasn't enough, so raids had to be staged from India via China, not exactly straightforward logistically. But from November 1944, with the capture of the Mariana Islands, the United States could now launch massive sustained bombing streams directly at Japan. And this is when the panic sets in, because the Japanese weren't entirely sure they possessed anything that could touch the B-29. Turns out they did. The new Type 3 12cm anti-aircraft gun could engage targets up to roughly 39,000 feet, comfortably above the typical 30,000 foot cruising altitude of B-29 raids. But due to resource shortages, only 157 of these guns were ever built. So instead of forming a layered defensive network, they became precious high-value assets, clustered around major cities, military installations, industrial targets like the Yawata Steelworks. A few were deployed overseas at strategic sites such as the Palembang oil fields in the Dutch East Indies. And despite their low numbers, they weren't irrelevant. Type 3 batteries around Tokyo were credited with shooting down at least 10 B-29s. But the Japanese still wanted something that could engage aircraft earlier, further, and higher, while throwing a much heavier bursting charge into the sky. Partly this was driven by lingering fears that maybe the B-29 could just fly higher if it wanted to. So engineers scaled up from 120mm to 150mm, with the formidable Type 5 15cm anti-aircraft gun introduced in early 1945, or 2605 in the Japanese imperial calendar, hence Type 5. This thing had an effective maximum ceiling of 52,000 feet, nearly 16 kilometers, almost 10 miles up into the sky. Each 150mm shell weighed about 50 kilograms and left the barrel at a blistering 930 meters per second. Though that extreme velocity came at a cost of barrel life, just 300 to 400 rounds. A semi-automatic loading system helped keep up the rate of fire, around 10 rounds per minute, decent for such a large weapon. Now on paper, this is the heaviest caliber, highest altitude anti-aircraft gun to see service in World War II. In reality, only 2 were completed before the war ended. Manufacturing challenges and the belated realization that the 12cm guns were good enough all conspired against mass production. Still, those 2 guns did see action. Emplaced at Kugiyama on the outskirts of Tokyo, during a raid on the 1st of August 1945, they shot down 2 B-29s. American air crews subsequently gave this particular Tokyo suburb a wide berth, suggesting this pair of guns made quite an impression. After the war, a US evaluation concluded that the Type 5 15cm was around 5 times more effective than the Type 3 12cm, due to its increased engagement range and firepower, though its potency was probably limited by its fire control, or lack thereof. The 2 guns only ever had an incomplete fire control setup, with an optical tracker and analog computer in a nearby bunker linked to the gun's optics electronically. They were intended to have radar, radar. But when it came to radar development, well, Japan had fallen far behind. Both the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy had their own radar development programs. Now, these two services are well known for epic levels of bickering and feuding, even at the expense of the overall Japanese war efforts. But within each service were multiple rival radar teams who also refused to cooperate with each other. That's the level of inter-service rivalry we're dealing with here. Or should that be intra-service rivalry? Now, Germany did supply examples of the Würzburg radar, which could be used for AA gun laying, and Japan managed to duplicate the system in limited numbers. By May 1945, experiments had begun to integrate radar fire control with the Type 5 guns, but Japan surrendered before the system ever truly matured. And at a strategic level, Japan simply couldn't build radar coverage at anything approaching the density required for an integrated air defense network. Also, as the American bombing campaign went on, B-29 switched focus from high-altitude daytime precision raids, precision being used generously here, to lower-altitude nighttime area bombing, often with incendiaries to massively destructive effects. Most notoriously, the firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945, the single deadliest air raid in history, killing more civilians than either atomic bombing, over 100,000 people. With this shift to lower level bombing, well, Japan's spectacular ultra-high altitude guns suddenly mattered less. What would have helped far more than bigger guns with higher ceilings would have just been, more radar, tied into a proper integrated air defense system. Something Germany, for all its flaws, had invested in heavily. Another major limitation facing Japanese heavy flak, and to be fair, German flak as well, wasn't the guns, it was the ammunition. More specifically, the absence of a proximity fuse. Because while Allied shells eventually gained the VT fuse, essentially a tiny radar set crammed into the nose of a projectile, Axis shells relied on mechanical time delay fuses, which meant every single round had to be told in advance exactly when to explode. The fuse would be set to burst at a calculated time or altitude based on estimated range, target speed, ballistic trajectory, and a whole chain of variables that were less than perfectly predictable. In other words, you weren't aiming for an aircraft, you were aiming for a patch of sky and hoping an aircraft happened to occupy it at the moment your shell arrived. Near misses counted for very little, unless the target was near the pre-calculated spot when the shell actually exploded. The VT fuse changed that equation completely. Now the shell didn't just fly to a predicted position, it could sense a nearby aircraft and detonate automatically at the point of maximum effect. No perfect timing solution required. The boost to lethality was enormous. Timed fuses also made loading more complex because every round required a firing solution which might need to be updated. Proximity fused ammo, by contrast, could just be fired away without a thought. Less fiddling around, more explosions exactly where you want them. So it's fair to say that Allied anti-aircraft weapons, while they might be slightly lower caliber, were significantly more capable overall. Weapons like the US 120mm gun M1, aka the Stratosphere Gun, a nickname it rightly earned thanks to a maximum ceiling of 57,000 feet. This was the heaviest American AA gun ever fielded. Adopted in 1944, it did technically see service in World War II. The 513th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion deployed to the Philippines with Stratosphere guns in early 1945, though they never got a chance to fire in anger. After the war, though, the Stratosphere gun found its purpose as part of America's early Cold War air defense umbrella, protecting exactly the sort of places you'd expect. Industrial centers, air bases, nuclear facilities, and the Sioux locks that connect Lake Superior to the lower Great Lakes. Specifically against the Tupolev Tu-4, the Soviet reverse-engineered copy of the B-29. So essentially, the Americans were preparing for the same problem that had terrified the Japanese just a few years earlier. Now, while the M1 couldn't quite match the Japanese Type 4's raw ceiling, it had something far more decisive: integration. Radar tracking, centralized fire control, networked batteries, plus, there were more than two of them. But with the arrival of surface-to-air missiles like the MIM-3 Nike Ajax in 1954, it wasn't just the case that missiles outperformed guns, they completely outclassed them and pretty much redefined air defense in terms of range, accuracy, and lethality. Even so, the M1 lingered for a while, serving as a theoretical second line of defense, right up until the Soviets introduced the R7 ICBM, at which point anti-aircraft artillery became about as relevant as a medieval castle facing an ICBM ppm. So by 1960, the Stratosphere gun was gone, but not completely. The gun found a second life as a tank weapon, which historically speaking is practically a rite of passage. High-velocity AA guns are natural candidates for anti-tank work. Flat trajectories, massive kinetic energy, excellent armor penetration. Velocity is velocity. Physics doesn't care about job titles. This trend goes back further, but probably the best known example is the 88mm gun on the Tiger, derived from the famous Flak gun, though the 8.8cm Pak 43 on the Tiger II and Jagdpanther was actually a new purpose-built anti-tank gun. And similarly, the 12.8cm Pak 44 on the Jagd Tiger was not derived from the Flak 40, but was instead a brand new design. Anyway, in 1945, the modified Stratosphere gun, now designated T-53, was mounted on the T-34 heavy tank prototype. T-34 being a not at all confusing designation for a tank in 1945, as if calling a 120mm anti-aircraft gun the M1 wasn't already confusing enough. The vehicle itself was America's late war answer to heavyweights like the Tiger and IS-2. It never entered mass production, but its gun did. It became the main armament of the M103, America's last heavy tank, serving from 1957 through to the early 70s. The British would also adopt a further modified version of the gun on the Conqueror heavy tank from 1955, and on the single FV4004 Conway, a prototype self-propelled gun based on the Centurion. With about 13 megajoules of muzzle energy, this is a 1950s tank gun firing a very heavy full-bore projectile that sits in roughly the same muzzle energy class as modern smoothbore weapons firing advanced long-rod penetrators. So whether in anti-aircraft or anti-tank form, an undeniably impressive weapon. But the heaviest anti-aircraft gun of the Cold War? Nope, the Soviets built bigger. The KS-30 was a 130mm gun with a maximum vertical reach of 22 kilometers, or 72,000 feet. Adopted in 1955 to protect strategic targets across the USSR, this thing was basically an interim measure for the Soviets, who knew surface-to-air missiles were coming, they just needed time to develop them. It also took heavy inspiration from Western designs, with an automatic ramming system lifted from the British 3.7-inch AA gun, and a fire control radar that was a copy of the American SCR 584, which had been provided as Lend-Lease aid during the war. Like the US Stratosphere gun, the KS-30 was gradually phased out in favor of guided missiles. But the Soviets kept some in reserve as late as 1988, because they just had this nagging fear that in an all-out war with NATO, well, what if we run out of missiles? At which point, naturally, you dust off the old guns and fire away like it's 1944. Over 700 KS-30s were built, and a handful even saw combat with communist forces in Vietnam. Though even by this point in the 1960s, they were already dinosaurs. Basically obsolete against the latest American jets, their fire control was also constantly being jammed by chaff and electronic countermeasures. Though none of these drawbacks stopped the Russians from building an even heavier version, the 152mm KM52. Built in 1957 with just 16 produced, a 49kg shell left the KM52's barrel at just over 1 kilometer per second, giving it a maximum ceiling of 30 kilometers, 98,000 feet. An anti-aircraft gun flirting with the edge of space. We're almost back up to Paris gun altitude here. And it gets better. The KM52 was intended to fire rocket-assisted projectiles, because apparently nearly 100,000 feet was considered a good start. Those rocket rounds were cancelled, however, along with the gun itself in 1958. But the KM52 remains the largest caliber, highest firing, dedicated anti-aircraft gun of all time. Still, even this monster didn't surpass the Paris gun's max altitude of 130,000 feet. And today, even that record is long gone. The highest altitude reached by a gun-fired projectile was achieved on November the 19th, 1966 by HARP, the High Altitude Research Project. A joint project between the US and Canada, the HARP supergun wasn't actually a weapon at all, but a system for testing the ballistics of space re-entry vehicles. It's just that instead of rockets, HARP used a gun. A 16-inch caliber, 119-foot long gun that could hurl a projectile at 2,164 meters per second to a maximum altitude of 180 kilometers. That's 112 miles or 590,000 feet. This thing was based on the American 16-inch naval gun used by the Iowa-class battleships. Except it wasn't just one gun, it was two of them welded together, then extended a bit more. Naval guns are actually another important category of large caliber AAA, because warships often carried dual-purpose weapons designed to engage engage both surface targets and aircraft. Guns like the American 5-inch, the British 5.25-inch, fast-firing, radar-directed, and highly effective in the anti-aircraft role. But at the extreme end, things get a bit more theoretical. Technically, nothing stopped a battleship from firing its gargantuan main battery high-explosive shells with fuses set to burst in mid-air. Some battleships even received specialized anti-aircraft ammunition for their main battery guns. The German Tirpitz, for example, fired such rounds from its 38cm guns at British aircraft, with underwhelming results. Similarly, Japan's Yamato came equipped with the Type 3 Sanshiki shell, an incendiary beehive round for its 46cm or 18.1-inch guns, the largest guns of any battleship. Generating a cone of flaming steel strips and shell fragments, the idea was to throw up a wall of shrapnel and fire that attacking aircraft would have to fly through. In practice, though, the few times they were used in combat, they weren't considered especially effective by either side. More of an intimidating fireworks display than a real threat. So while you could argue that Yamato had the largest anti-aircraft guns of all time, its 18-inch weapons were also some of the least effective anti-aircraft guns of all time, and their practical engagement ceiling was far below the much smaller caliber guns we've discussed. Guns like the American 120mm Stratosphere Gun, Japan's 150mm B-29 killer, and the Soviet 152mm KS-52, which sent shells so high it's surprising the Russians never strapped a stray dog to them. As such, it takes the top spot on this list, both in maximum altitude and caliber, because an 18-inch battleship gun is not a serious air defense weapon. Of course, guided missiles eventually arrived and rendered super heavy flak guns obsolete, but anti-aircraft guns in general are still very much alive. In fact, increasingly relevant in a world of cheap drones, where using $1 million missile to shoot down a $100 target is not a sustainable exchange rate. Nowadays, though, it's more about a high rate of fire, as opposed to a high rate of height. Thank you for watching. This was a fun one. I really wanted to talk about the Japanese Type 5, but it wasn't enough for a standalone video. So I thought, hey, let's just do a list of super heavy flak guns. I hope you enjoyed it. Please give it a like if you did, subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you next time.